Hello, everybody. So, in a glorious display of bipartisan triumph, the Congress managed to come together and pass a massive spending bill to the tune of around $300 billion, $160 billion of which is going to fund the military over 2 years. Now, this military funding provision actually exceeds what President Trump had requested in his budget request last year. So Trump ran on a platform of giving the military essentially everything they wanted, not worrying about the financial burden of doing so, and insisting that this was absolutely crucial in order to achieve optimal military readiness and strength and everything else. And yet, the Congress, on a bipartisan basis, led by Republicans and Democrats, actually exceeded Trump's request and gave the military even more than they ever could have wanted, which is a pretty amazing fact. And one thing that's really significant about this military funding provision is that it extends over 2 years. And one thing that the defense sector has been complaining about over and over again is that the continuing resolutions and the incremental funding patterns that they've been subject to over the past couple years due to the Budget Control Act of 2011 has hamstrung their ability to innovate. That's the word they use in the jargon of the business community. They can't innovate sufficiently because they can't rely on a stable source of funding. So this solves that problem for them, at least in the short term. And they are overjoyed about it because this is something that they've been talking about in their internal communications, at their industry events, on their earnings calls with Wall Street investors for a very long time, and finally they were able to get it done. And what's interesting is, if you go and look at their most recent earnings calls with investors, these are the Wall Street guys who advise them on their financial portfolios and so forth, you can actually get a better sense that this bill was in the offing than if you had followed just the typical legislative maneuvering in Washington. So, for example, Marilyn Houston, who's the CEO of Lockheed Martin, the largest of the defense contractors, was on an earnings call in late January, and she said that she was very encouraged about legislative movement on this score, and that something could be coming that was very fortuitous for the industry. And likewise, if you look at what Tom Kennedy, who's the CEO of Raytheon, said, he was optimistic that there would be some resolution to this budget impasse. So if you had followed, Morning Joe and the cable news chatter, you might have thought that the Republicans and Democrats are just so irreparably polarized that, of course, they couldn't come up with any kind of mutual accommodation and send a spending bill to the president's desk. But lo and behold, the defense industry titans were actually a lot more prescient than the political prognosticators. So that, I think, should be a broader lesson about how politics operates in the country. Another thing that I think is significant is that people often point out, or they assert, that norms have corroded in the United States such that the institutions can't effectively counterbalance the quote-unquote disruption caused by Trump. I know I'm kind of unwittingly using some of these incredibly tedious buzzwords, but so be it. And that there is this subtle authoritarianism, or maybe overt authoritarianism, that's on the rise in the institutions because the norms have been so upended, can't combat these rising tides of nefarious forces. Well, I think there's some truth to some of that. However, let's think of it this way. Whichever norm allowed Republicans and Democrats to put aside their differences and come up with a huge increase in military spending is apparently still intact and allowed them to come to that mutual arrangement. And whichever norm allows the Republicans to totally discard their concern for debt and deficits, which utterly animated their entire political strategy under Obama for, virtually Obama's entire tenure, whichever norm allowed them to discard that consideration, I think, is still intact, apparently. So when people talk about norms, I think they're sort of selective in terms of how they apply that so-called analysis. But that aside, Chuck Schumer, whatever you may think of him, and I think he is definitely largely concerned about his own power. He has an amoral calculus on many things. But from the standpoint of pure political legislative maneuvering, this was a pretty formidable feat on his part. The Republicans control every branch of government. They could consolidate as a party and just push through whatever they wanted to push through if they had any kind of internal party cohesion. But Schumer is somewhat adept at identifying the fissures within the Republican Party, at least in the Senate, and then using that as leverage to attain some of what his party wants in terms of the legislative negotiations. So, as people know, the deal didn't resolve the DACA issue, but it did result in the funding of certain major Democratic priorities, such as community health centers, the biggest infusion of federal dollars thus far in relation to the opioid issue, and funding for the National Institutes of Health, 10-year funding now for the Children's Health Insurance Program, which had been a big one for a number of months. So, not saying that Schumer is necessarily a moral hero here, but in terms of political tact, I think he's actually demonstrated that he's very adroit in certain respects. But of course, you couldn't be an adroit politician and want to accomplish bad or lackluster things. So it's not necessarily a moral endorsement. It's just a tactical, an acknowledgement of his tactical acumen, so to say. So that is basically what I think the main takeaways are from this bill. I did write a piece for TYT Investigates, which went through some of these statements that the defense sector CEOs and CFOs and other people in leadership have said over the course of their most recent communications with Wall Street. And one thing that they are pleased with, in addition, is that there has been a change in the overall defense strategy by the U.S. government, which is actually very fortuitous for them as well. Now, these kind of strategy policy proclamations aren't necessarily set in stone. They can be changed at a moment's notice. But the Pentagon in January did release a national defense strategy outline, which said that basically the country's foreign policy emphasis is going to shift from counterterrorism toward the great power struggles with rival nation states. And of course, Russia is foremost among them, as well as China. So the defense sector is very pleased with this because it allows them to return to a slightly more conventional mode of weaponry production, because you can anticipate with a little more foresight what the contingencies are going to be with respect to China and Russia than you could with respect to a terrorist faction somewhere. So that allows them to plan in the future for producing these missile systems, for producing new aircraft. And the CEOs are very heartened about this development because it means that various capabilities that they are responsible for are going to be in high demand now and in the future. So they basically portray themselves as in total lockstep with especially Secretary of Defense Mattis and also Trump, although Trump isn't nearly as integral in these deliberations as Mattis apparently. So they have a big friend in Mattis, and they want to basically give him all the resources that he claims he needs for military readiness. And then this has to do with this whole shift from counterterrorism operations to the kind of classic counteracting the rise of various rival powers. So with this new funding in place and with the tax bill having been passed, the defense sector is in a wonderful position if you're looking at just their economic forecast. In terms of the moral health of the country, it's very much debatable whether that means that we're in a better position. I would argue probably no. But they're very, very heartened about what has transpired. The defense companies have claimed, at least, for example, Lockheed Martin claimed, as we reported at TYT over the fall, that they would use whatever windfall they received from this tax reform that was passed in December to hire more people, to basically further the Trump administration's economic vision. And in their most recent earnings call, with tax reform passed, they don't have a whole lot in the way of tangible steps that they're going to be taking as a result of this tax reform. They're going to pay off some pension obligations. They kind of faint at the potential for hiring and innovation, but there's nothing tangible, and we have no way to really hold them account for those promises, even though they were presumably influential in actually allowing for the bill to be passed, the tax reform bill, that is. So there's a lot of people in that sector who have smiles on their faces today, and who feel that their priorities have been enacted in the halls of power in Washington. No great surprise there. However, it's something to be mindful of as we go forward. So that'll do it for now. Read the piece that I referenced, which will be, of course, linked in the description box, and have a great day.